Monroe, Michigan, 2012, in the heart of a modest Midwestern town, a story unfolded that would horrify neighbors, devastate a community, and send shockwaves far beyond state lines. At its center was a teenage girl, 16 years old, who longed for independence, recognition, and control over her life. Her name was Tia Skinner, and in a chilling twist that stunned everyone who knew her, the greatest threat to her parents' lives did not come from outside the family. It came from their own daughter, plotting with those she called friends. Tia lived with her parents, Paul and Mara Skinner, in a quiet home on the outskirts of town. The Skinners were, by all accounts, loving and hardworking. Paul, 47, was a dedicated father who provided for his family, while Mara, 44, was nurturing, supportive, and deeply invested in her daughter's future. Friends of the family described them as stable and close-knit, yet beneath that surface, tension brewed between teenage rebellion and parental authority. Like many teenagers, Tia wanted more freedom than her parents were willing to grant. She had fallen in love with a boy, Stephen Colton, whom her parents disapproved of. Paul and Mara worried about the relationship, concerned it was leading their daughter astray. They imposed rules, curfews, restrictions on seeing Stephen that Tia saw as oppressive. What should have been normal family disputes soon escalated into bitter fights. Tia began to feel suffocated, trapped, convinced that her parents were her enemies rather than her protectors. In her frustration, Tia began confiding in Stephen and a friend named James Preston. She painted her parents as obstacles, tyrants who stood in the way of her happiness. Over time, those conversations turned darker. Fantasies about running away shifted into discussions of eliminating the problem entirely. Words like kill and get rid of them slipped into their late-night talks, whether out of desperation, manipulation, or a dangerous mix of both. Tia began to believe that the only way she could be free was if her parents were dead. On the night of November 12th, 2010, the plan was set into motion. Stephen and James, armed with knives, crept into the Skinner home while Tia waited outside. She had provided them with the layout of the house, told them where her parents slept, and even left a window unlocked to make their entry easier. Her role was not passive. She was the architect, the one who opened the door, both literally and figuratively, to the nightmare that followed. Around midnight, the attackers struck. Paul and Mara were asleep in their bedroom when the intruders descended upon them. Paul woke first, fighting to defend himself and his wife. Mara screamed as the attackers' knives flashed in the dark. In the chaos, Paul was stabbed multiple times, his body collapsing under the brutal assault. Mara, too, was stabbed repeatedly as she tried to shield herself and fight back. The violence was frenzied, raw, merciless. Despite her injuries, Mara managed to stumble out of the house, bleeding and gasping for air. Neighbors were awakened by the commotion, lights flickering on across the street. One neighbor rushed to her aid, calling 911 as Mara collapsed on the front lawn. When emergency responders arrived, the scene inside the house was one of devastation. Paul Skinner lay dead in his bedroom. His life ended in the place he should have been safest. Mara was rushed to the hospital, her survival uncertain. Police quickly pieced together the crime. The forced entry showed no signs of struggle at the point of entry, suggesting someone had let the attackers in. Mara, even in her injured state, provided crucial information. She told investigators that her daughter Tia had been involved, that this was no random home invasion. In a cruel twist, the girl she had loved and protected had orchestrated the attack that killed her husband and nearly killed her. The revelation stunned the community. Tia Skinner, with her blonde hair and innocent appearance, hardly looked the part of a murderer. Teachers, classmates, and neighbors struggled to reconcile the smiling teenager they knew with the mastermind of such a brutal crime. But as police dug deeper, the evidence was damning. Text messages between Tia and Stephen outlined the plan. She had expressed her desire to be free of her parents' control, to live with Stephen without interference. James Preston's testimony later confirmed her active role in planning every detail. Within days, Tia was arrested and charged with murder, attempted murder, and conspiracy. The news spread rapidly. Headlines painted her as a manipulative teenager who had turned on the very people who had raised her. Her father was dead. Her mother was scarred for life, both physically and emotionally. The betrayal cut deeper than the crime itself. The trial, held in 2012, was a grim spectacle. Prosecutors laid out the evidence with meticulous care: the unlocked window, the text messages, the testimony of her accomplices. They argued that Tia's motive was selfishness, that she was willing to sacrifice her parents' lives simply to be with her boyfriend without restriction. The defense attempted to shift blame, suggesting that Stephen and James had been the driving forces, that Tia was manipulated by older, dangerous men. But the evidence showed otherwise. She had been the one to provide the house key. She had been the one to draw the map of her home, labeling where her parents slept. She had been the one who stood outside, waiting as her parents screamed inside. Perhaps the most heartbreaking testimony came from Mara herself, who survived the attack. In court, she described waking to the sight of men with knives, fighting for her life, watching her husband die beside her. When asked about her daughter's role, Mara's pain was evident. She had lost her husband, and in many ways, she had lost her daughter too. The betrayal was almost too much to bear. The jury deliberated, but the conclusion was inevitable. Tia Skinner was found guilty of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For a 16-year-old, it was a sentence that meant she would spend the rest of her natural life behind bars. The public reaction was mixed. Some saw Tia as a cold-blooded killer, a teenager so consumed by selfish desire that she plotted her parents' murder without remorse. Others wondered if she had been manipulated, if immaturity and pressure from her boyfriend had clouded her judgment. But even those sympathetic to her youth could not ignore the brutality of the crime and the clarity of her intent. For the town of Monroe, the case left deep scars. Paul Skinner was remembered as a devoted father, his life cut short in the most unimaginable way. Mara, who bore both the physical scars of the attack and the emotional devastation of losing her husband and daughter in one night, became a symbol of resilience. She rebuilt her life as best she could, but nothing could erase the memories of that night or the betrayal she endured. The house where the murder occurred became a site of hushed whispers. Neighbors avoided looking too long at the windows, knowing the story they concealed. For students at Tia's school, the memory of her trial and conviction lingered, a reminder of how easily the line between teenage rebellion and unthinkable violence can blur. The Skinner case raised haunting questions about adolescence, influence, and responsibility. At what point does rebellion cross into destruction? How do love and anger twist so tightly together that a daughter can plot against her parents? And what drives someone to believe that freedom requires blood? As the years have passed, Tia Skinner remains in prison, her name etched in the annals of true crime as one of the youngest masterminds of parental murder in the United States. Her accomplices, Stephen and James, also received lengthy prison sentences. None of them will walk free for decades, if ever. But the deepest tragedy lies not in their fates, but in the fate of the family that once was. A home filled with ordinary arguments, laughter, and love was shattered beyond repair. A father's life was ended. A mother's trust was destroyed. And a daughter, who should have been the promise of tomorrow, became instead the architect of despair. The story of Tia Skinner forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the monsters are not strangers lurking in dark alleys. They are children we raise, neighbors we greet, faces we think we know. It is a reminder that evil does not always wear a mask. Sometimes it looks like innocence, and in that realization lies the true horror of this case. Hollingswood, New Jersey, 2003. To the outside world, the Jackson home looked unremarkable. A modest house in a modest neighborhood with a white picket fence and the sounds of children sometimes drifting out into the street. But behind those walls, concealed from neighbors, teachers, and even social workers, lay one of the most shocking cases of child neglect and abuse in modern American history. It was not a story of sudden violence, but of years of starvation, cruelty, and indifference. And it all came to light when a boy named Bruce ran away and asked a neighbor for food. The Jacksons, Raymond, and Vanessa had adopted 4 boys in addition to raising their 3 biological children. To outsiders, they appeared generous, even admirable. Adoption is often seen as an act of compassion, and the Jacksons cultivated that image, presenting themselves as a loving family willing to take in children who needed care. They were churchgoers, seemingly ordinary parents in an ordinary suburban town, but their public image was a mask, and the truth was far more disturbing. For years, Bruce Jackson and his adopted brothers, Keith, Tyrone, and Michael, were kept inside the home, malnourished, denied basic care, and treated not as children, but as prisoners. The boys were forced to eat scraps, scavenging through trash when they could, while the Jacksons' biological children were fed normal meals. The adopted boys wasted away, their bodies so thin that strangers later described them as skeletal. Bruce, the oldest of the 4 adopted children, suffered the most visible effects. At 19 years old, he weighed just 45 pounds. His body was stunted and frail, his frame closer to that of a small child than a young man. He was desperate, hungry, and trapped in a cycle of abuse. On October 10th, 2003, Bruce finally found the courage to escape. He climbed out of a window and made his way to a neighbor's home, knocking on the door in the early hours of the morning. When the neighbor opened it, Bruce begged for food. Shocked by his appearance, gaunt, malnourished, barely able to stand, the neighbor called the police. What officers discovered inside the Jackson household was almost beyond belief. The 3 other adopted boys were found in similar conditions, emaciated and malnourished, their ribs protruding, their eyes sunken. They were immediately taken to a hospital where doctors confirmed the severity of their starvation. One boy, 12 years old, weighed just 28 pounds. Another 10 years old weighed only 36. The case quickly drew national headlines. How could children live in such conditions in the middle of a suburban neighborhood under the supposed care of loving adoptive parents? The Jacksons, who had presented themselves as charitable caregivers, were exposed as abusers who had exploited the children under their roof. The investigation revealed a pattern of deliberate neglect. The adopted boys were denied adequate food, medical care, and basic human dignity. They were not permitted to eat meals with the family. Instead, they were given scraps or forced to fend for themselves. While the Jacksons' biological children appeared healthy and well cared for, the adopted boys withered away. Neighbors were stunned. Some admitted they had noticed the boys looked thin but assumed they were simply small for their age. Others said they rarely saw them outside at all. Teachers, too, had raised concerns, but those warnings somehow slipped through the cracks of a child welfare system already overwhelmed with cases. As details emerged, the story became even more disturbing. Reports suggested that the Jacksons may have been motivated by financial gain. By adopting the boys, they received state subsidies and support. Yet, instead of using that money for the children's care, they appeared to pocket it, leaving the boys to starve. The public outrage was swift and fierce. How had the system failed so completely? How had no one noticed the severity of the neglect? And how had the Jacksons managed to maintain their facade for so long? When the case went to trial, Raymond and Vanessa Jackson faced multiple charges of child endangerment and abuse. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of a household where children were treated as burdens rather than sons, where cruelty replaced compassion, and where neglect became a slow form of violence. The defense attempted to argue that the Jacksons had been overwhelmed, that they had struggled financially and emotionally to care for so many children. But the evidence spoke louder than excuses. These were not simple cases of poverty or mismanagement. They were acts of deliberate deprivation. The jury saw through the defense. In 2005, both Raymond and Vanessa Jackson were convicted. Raymond was sentenced to prison, while Vanessa received probation and community service, a decision that sparked further outrage given the extent of the abuse. Many felt the punishment did not fit the crime. For Bruce and his brothers, the trial was only part of their journey. After their rescue, they were placed in foster care, where they slowly began to recover. Doctors reported that, with proper nutrition, the boys began to gain weight and show signs of improvement. But the psychological scars ran deep. Years of neglect and abuse could not be undone overnight. Bruce, in particular, became a symbol of resilience. Despite his ordeal, he spoke publicly about his experiences, raising awareness about the failures of the system and the hidden dangers of abuse behind closed doors. His story served as a reminder that even in ordinary neighborhoods, children can suffer unimaginable cruelty out of sight. The Jackson case also forced a reckoning within New Jersey's child welfare system. Officials admitted that red flags had been missed. Teachers had reported concerns about the boys' weight and appearance, but those warnings were not properly acted upon. Caseworkers had visited the home but failed to recognize the signs of abuse. The system had failed the very children it was meant to protect. Reforms were promised, but for many, the damage was already done. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming that appearances tell the whole story, about the need for vigilance when it comes to child welfare, and about the responsibilities of communities to protect their most vulnerable members. For neighbors in Collingswood, the house where the Jacksons lived became a symbol of betrayal. Behind its ordinary walls, horrors had unfolded while they carried on with their daily lives. Some admitted they felt guilt, wondering if they should have asked more questions, if they should have noticed more. Others said they had been completely blindsided, deceived by the Jacksons' facade of normalcy. The public wrestled with the question of how to define the Jacksons' crime. Was it neglect, born of indifference? Was it exploitation, driven by greed? Or was it a form of abuse as cruel and deliberate as physical violence? Whatever the label, the impact was the same. Children who should have been safe and cared for were instead starved, humiliated, and nearly killed by the very people entrusted with their lives. Looking back, the case of the Jackson family still haunts those who remember it. The images of emaciated boys, their fragile frames, a testament to years of deprivation, remain etched in the public consciousness. It is a reminder that evil does not always come with raised fists or sharp knives. Sometimes it comes with an empty plate, a locked refrigerator, and the silence of neighbors who do not see or do not want to see. Today, Bruce and his brothers live with the legacy of their ordeal. They are grown now, carrying the weight of memories that can never fully be erased. Yet their survival is itself a testament to strength. They endured what no child should ever have to endure, and they lived to tell their story. The Jackson case remains one of the most infamous examples of child abuse in modern history. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the systems meant to protect children, about the role of communities in noticing and intervening, and about the darkness that can hide in plain sight. And it leaves us with a haunting truth. Sometimes the most dangerous neighbors are not strangers at all, but the very people who smile at you from across the fence, who wave as they mow their lawns, who carry the mask of normalcy while committing unspeakable acts behind closed doors. Cheshire, Connecticut, July 23rd, 2007. A summer evening in a wealthy suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where safety was assumed, where neighbors waved as they watered their lawns and children played outside without fear. But on that night, inside the home of the Petit family, horror descended in a way so brutal, so senseless, that it would scar not just a family but an entire community. The tragedy of what became known as the Cheshire Home Invasion remains one of the most chilling examples of how ordinary neighbors can turn into killers. The Petit family lived in a large, comfortable home at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. Dr. William Petit, a respected physician, lived there with his wife, Jennifer Hawke Pettit, and their two daughters, 17-year-old Haley and 11-year-old Michaela. They were the picture of suburban success, active in their church, well-liked by their neighbors, a family that embodied stability and kindness. No one could have imagined that within the walls of their home, they would face a nightmare orchestrated by two men who lived only towns away. Stephen Hayes and Joshua Komisarjevsky were not strangers to crime. Both men had long criminal records, histories of burglary, drugs, and theft. They were neighbors to someone, members of nearby communities, but instead of blending into society, they thrived in its shadows. On July 22nd, the two met at a halfway house where they began planning their next crime. Their idea was simple at first: rob a house, get money, and disappear. But their plan, fueled by recklessness, violence, and a disturbing lack of humanity, spiraled into one of the most infamous crimes in Connecticut's history. The target was chosen almost at random. Joshua spotted Jennifer Hawk Petite and her daughter Michaela at a local grocery store. He followed them, taking note of their car and address. Later that night, Hayes and Komisarjevsky armed themselves and set out for the Petite home. At around 3 a.m., they broke in. Dr. Petite was asleep on the couch when he was bludgeoned with a baseball bat. The blows fractured his skull, leaving him dazed and bleeding, but alive. He was dragged to the basement and tied up. Hayes and Komisarjevsky then made their way upstairs, where they bound Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela in their bedrooms. The nightmare had begun. For hours, the intruders held the family hostage. They rummaged through the house, searching for money, jewelry, anything of value. When they discovered the family's bank account, they forced Jennifer to accompany Hayes to the bank the next morning, while Komisarjevsky stayed behind to guard the daughters and their father. Jennifer, terrified and under threat, withdrew $15,000 in cash. Surveillance footage later showed her at the bank, pale and trembling, but alive. She confided quietly to the teller that her family was being held hostage. The teller alerted authorities, but police protocols delayed their response. Meanwhile, back at the house, the cruelty escalated. Komisarjevsky sexually assaulted Michaela, the youngest daughter, while Hayes waited with Jennifer at the bank. When they returned, Hayes raped Jennifer as well. The crimes had shifted from burglary to sadistic domination, acts that would leave scars on everyone who survived. The final act of violence came suddenly, without warning. Hayes and Komisarjevsky strangled Jennifer to death. Then they poured gasoline throughout the house and set it ablaze. The flames spread quickly, engulfing the home in smoke and fire. Inside, Haley and Michaela, bound to their beds, screamed for help as the fire consumed the rooms around them. They struggled but could not escape. The heat and smoke overcame them, and both girls perished in the inferno. Only Dr. William Petite managed to survive. Despite his severe head injuries, he broke free from his restraints, crawled out of the basement, and staggered across the yard to a neighbor's home. Bloodied and dazed, he collapsed on the porch, crying out for help. His neighbors, stunned by the sight, called 911. By the time firefighters and police arrived, the house was an inferno. The bodies of Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela were recovered from the ashes. Hayes and Komisarjevsky attempted to flee in the Petite family's car, but they were quickly apprehended after crashing into police barricades. The horror of what they had done was undeniable. The crime shocked Connecticut and the nation. How could such brutality happen in a quiet suburban town? The sheer savagery of the acts, murder, sexual assault, arson, made the case one of the most infamous in modern true crime history. The trials of Hayes and Komisarjevsky drew massive public attention. Prosecutors laid out the evidence in graphic detail, presenting the timeline of events, the testimony of survivors, and the horrific facts of the fire. Jurors listened to William Petit recount his ordeal, his voice breaking as he described waking to the sound of his family's screams and the helplessness of being tied up in the basement while his wife and daughters were attacked. The defense attempted to portray Hayes and Komisarjevsky as products of troubled backgrounds, men with histories of abuse and addiction, but their pasts could not excuse the sadism of their actions. The jury was unmoved. Both men were convicted of multiple counts of murder, sexual assault, arson, and kidnapping. Hayes was sentenced to death in 2010, and Komisarjevsky followed with a death sentence in 2011. However, Connecticut later abolished the death penalty, and their sentences were converted to life imprisonment without parole. For William Petit, the survivor, the trial was both a reckoning and a reopening of wounds. He had lost his wife, his two daughters, his entire family in one night. In interviews, he described the loneliness, the grief, and the struggle to find purpose after such devastation. He spoke of Haley's dreams of becoming a doctor, Michaela's love of cooking, Jennifer's kindness. He carried their memories, refusing to let them be defined only by their deaths. The community of Cheshire rallied around him, holding vigils, raising funds, and dedicating memorials to the Petit family. A foundation was created in their honor, focusing on supporting victims of violence and promoting education. Out of tragedy, a legacy of compassion began to grow, yet the haunting questions lingered. Could the crime have been prevented? Police had been alerted by the bank teller when Jennifer withdrew the money under duress. Officers had even gathered outside the Petit home before the fire was set, but they held back, following protocols that required waiting for evidence of imminent danger. That hesitation, some argued, cost the lives of Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela. The debate over police response, victim safety, and hostage protocols continues to this day. The Cheshire home invasion is remembered as a brutal reminder of how violence can erupt in the most unlikely places, how neighbors, people who pass by unnoticed on sidewalks, who live in halfway houses down the road, can carry within them the capacity for unspeakable cruelty. Years later, William Petit found a path toward rebuilding. He remarried and had a son, carrying forward with a mixture of resilience and sorrow. Yet he has never forgotten, and he never could. The loss of Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela remains a wound that cannot be fully healed. For the town of Cheshire, the Petit house stood as a scar for years before it was eventually torn down. The land where it once stood became a silent memorial, a place where neighbors would stop and remember, where candles burned on anniversaries of the crime. The story forces us to confront the fragility of safety, the illusion that wealth or suburban calm can insulate us from violence. It reminds us that predators can lurk in plain sight, planning crimes that shatter lives in an instant. The Petit family story is one of unbearable loss, but also one of resilience. Out of ashes came not only grief, but a determination to honor the lives taken. The horror of that July night remains, but so does the memory of a family who should have grown old together, laughing in their kitchen, celebrating milestones, living the life that was stolen from them. And in the end, it leaves us with the chilling reality that sometimes the most dangerous killers are not strangers in dark alleys, but men who drive down quiet suburban streets, choosing houses at random, turning neighbors into victims with no warning at all. Doraville, Georgia, March 2005. In a quiet suburban neighborhood just beyond the hum of Atlanta's traffic lived a family whose story would end in betrayal and blood. It was the kind of place where children played basketball in driveways, where families gathered for cookouts, and where neighbors exchanged polite smiles. Safety was assumed, trust was unspoken, but behind one set of doors beneath the roof of the Green family home, danger was growing from within. The Green family seemed ordinary. The father, Howard, worked long hours at a manufacturing company. His wife, Marilyn, was a homemaker, known in the neighborhood for her friendly demeanor and church attendance. Their son, Christopher, was just 16, a lanky teenager with an awkward smile. Christopher was the kind of kid people described as quiet, maybe a little shy, but not threatening. No one suspected that beneath that exterior, rage and obsession were beginning to boil. Christopher Green had been struggling for years. At school, he was often bullied for being awkward, for not fitting in, for his inability to socialize with the ease of his classmates. He was drawn to violent video games and dark fantasies, things most teenagers encounter, but rarely take too far. Teachers noticed his withdrawal, his fixation on violent stories, but dismissed it as a phase. To his parents, he was just moody, difficult, a teenager navigating the storm of adolescence. But Christopher's mind was already slipping into darker territory. By 2005, the Green family was struggling with tension at home. Howard's long shifts kept him absent, while Marilyn took the brunt of dealing with Christopher's outbursts. Arguments erupted often about school, about friends, about the direction his life was taking. To neighbors, the Greens seemed normal. No one heard the raised voices behind closed doors. No one saw the growing fracture between a teenage boy and the parents who loved him but could not reach him. On the night of March 12th, Christopher sat alone in his bedroom, staring at his reflection in a darkened computer screen. He had stolen his father's pistol weeks earlier, tucking it away under his mattress. He had fantasized about using it, imagined what it would feel like, considered the reactions it would provoke. To Christopher, violence was no longer a passing thought. It had become a solution. Shortly after midnight, while Howard and Marilyn were asleep, Christopher retrieved the weapon. He walked down the hallway in the silence of the suburban night, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. He entered his parents' bedroom and stood over them. For a moment, he hesitated. These were his parents, the people who had raised him, who had provided for him, who had given him everything he had. But in Christopher's mind, they were also his enemies, people who didn't understand him, who restrained him, who became obstacles to the world he wanted. He raised the gun and pulled the trigger. Howard was hit first. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the house. Marilyn awoke in shock, confusion flashing across her face as she realized her son was standing at the foot of the bed with a gun in his hands. Before she could speak, before she could move, Christopher fired again. Within moments, both of his parents were dead. The house fell into silence once more, but it was no longer the silence of a sleeping home. It was the silence of death. Christopher stood there, breathing heavily, his ears ringing, the smell of gunpowder mixing with the faint scent of laundry detergent and a perfume that clung to the room. He had done it. The fantasy was real. What he did next stunned investigators. Rather than fleeing, Christopher dragged his parents' bodies into the bathroom. He placed them side by side on the floor, covering them partially with towels. It was an act that confused detectives, part concealment, part ritual. Then he calmly returned to his room, logged onto his computer, and began chatting with friends online as if nothing had happened. For 2 days, Christopher lived in the house with his parents' corpses only a few feet away. He ate meals, played games, and even invited a friend over. To his friend, the visit seemed normal, though the house carried a strange odor that Christopher explained away as a plumbing problem. Beneath the surface of suburban life, horror lingered inside the Green household, unnoticed by the neighbors who waved as they collected their mail. It wasn't until relatives grew concerned that the crime was uncovered. Marilyn's sister had been unable to reach her by phone and grew increasingly alarmed. When she came to the house, Christopher met her at the door, blocking her from entering. Suspicion rose, and soon police were called to perform a welfare check. When officers entered, the truth became undeniable. The smell of decay led them to the bathroom, where they discovered Howard and Marilyn's bodies. Christopher was arrested on the spot. His demeanor was disturbingly calm. He confessed quickly, showing little remorse. In interviews, he described the murders almost clinically, as if recounting a task he had completed rather than the destruction of his own family. The community of Doraville was shattered. How could a son murder his parents in cold blood? Neighbors who had known Christopher since childhood struggled to reconcile the awkward boy they had seen riding his bike with the killer described in news reports. Teachers replayed memories of his troubled behavior, wondering if they had missed warning signs. For everyone who knew the family, the crime was not just shocking, it was unthinkable. At trial, prosecutors painted Christopher as a cold-blooded killer who had planned his parents' deaths. They highlighted his theft of the gun, his fantasies about violence, and his chilling behavior after the murders. The defense argued that Christopher was mentally unstable, that years of bullying and isolation had warped his perception of reality. Psychiatrists debated his mental state. Was he suffering from depression, psychosis, or simply cruelty? The jury had little difficulty reaching a verdict. Christopher was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the relatives who filled the courtroom, it was a bitter resolution. Justice had been served, but nothing could erase the horror of a son killing his parents in their sleep. The Green family home was eventually sold, but neighbors said it never felt the same. For years afterward, people avoided walking past it at night, and whispers of what happened there lingered in the air. The bathroom, once just another room in a suburban house, had become a symbol of unspeakable violence. What haunts many about the case is not just the brutality of the act, but the intimacy of it. Violence between strangers is terrifying, but violence within families cuts deeper. These were not random victims. They were parents who loved their son, who provided for him, who tried to guide him. The betrayal was total, and it shattered the assumption that family bonds are unbreakable. True crime often confronts us with the darkest sides of humanity, but the murder of Howard and Marilyn Green forces us to ask questions about youth, isolation, and the line between fantasy and reality. How many other teenagers harbor violent thoughts that never materialize? What tipped Christopher into action? Was it neglect, mental illness, or simply the cold calculation of a boy who decided to become a killer? In prison, Christopher remains largely unrepentant. He rarely speaks of his parents, never attends therapy sessions offered to him, and has been described by guards as withdrawn, uncommunicative. He is serving his sentence in silence, the rest of his life defined by the night he destroyed his family. For relatives left behind, the grief never fades. Marilyn's sister has spoken publicly about the crime, describing the betrayal not just of losing her loved ones, but of knowing the killer was family. Howard's co-workers held vigils remembering a man dedicated to his work and his family who never deserved such an end. The case remains a chilling reminder of the dangers hidden within ordinary homes. The Greens were not strangers living in a dangerous part of town. They were neighbors, friends, people who lived behind a neatly trimmed lawn and a welcoming front door. Their story is a reminder that evil can grow quietly, nourished by anger and resentment, until one night it erupts with devastating consequences. When people remember Doraville now, they remember the house where Christopher Green murdered his parents. They remember the bathroom where their bodies were found, the quiet street that became the scene of a crime, and they remember that even in the most peaceful suburbs, danger sometimes lurks not outside but within. Cleveland, Ohio, November 1998. In the heart of a working-class neighborhood where houses sat shoulder to shoulder and neighbors knew one another's routines, the Mendez family lived what seemed to be a simple, unremarkable life. Their home was a modest two-story structure with a peeling white fence and a small yard that Marilyn Mendez tended to with pride. Her husband, Raul, worked construction jobs, often long hours that left him tired but satisfied. Their son, Daniel, was 24 years old, still living at home, drifting between part-time jobs and searching for his place in the world. To those on the outside, the Mendez family looked ordinary. Raul and Marilyn were quiet, hard-working, and friendly enough to exchange greetings with the neighbors. Daniel was polite but distant, a young man who never seemed to quite fit in with the crowd his age. He kept to himself, preferring late nights in his room listening to music or scrolling through message boards on his computer. He wasn't seen as threatening, just different. But beneath that facade of normalcy, fractures were growing. Raul had become increasingly frustrated with Daniel's lack of direction. Arguments flared over money, over responsibility, over Daniel's failure to move forward in life. Marilyn often played the role of mediator, trying to soothe tempers, but she too was losing patience. Daniel's dependence on his parents grated on both of them, and resentment began to seep into every conversation. For Daniel, these arguments weren't just typical family disagreements. He internalized them as constant attacks, blows against his self-worth. He saw himself as cornered, criticized, unappreciated. Friends later recalled that Daniel had begun making bitter comments about his parents, framing himself as a victim and, more disturbingly, hinting that he sometimes imagined life without them. No one took him seriously. It was venting, they thought. Just anger talking. On the night of November 14th, tensions reached a breaking point. Raul returned home late from work, exhausted and irritable. A simple argument about chores spiraled into shouting, and Daniel stormed off to his room, seething. He sat in the dark, listening to the muffled sound of his parents still bickering downstairs. His mind replayed every insult, every scolding, every moment he felt humiliated, and then, as it had many times before, his thoughts turned to violence. In the drawer beside his bed was a kitchen knife he had taken days earlier, almost on impulse, almost as if preparing for a moment he couldn't quite admit to himself. That night, as anger boiled, Daniel's thoughts aligned into something clearer. He was no longer imagining. He was deciding. Sometime after midnight, when Raul and Marilyn had gone to bed, Daniel crept from his room with the knife in hand. The house was silent except for the groan of the floorboards beneath his feet. He pushed open the door to his parents' bedroom and stood there, staring at the two figures who had raised him, who had sheltered him, who had also, he believed, beaten down every ounce of his pride. The attack was swift and brutal. He plunged the knife into his father first, the sound of Raoul's gasp cutting through the night. Marilyn woke in horror, screaming his name, but Daniel turned the blade on her before she could escape. The bedroom became a scene of chaos, blood soaking into the sheets, the walls echoing with her cries until they fell silent. When it was over, Daniel stood trembling, his chest heaving, the knife slick in his hands. The two people who had been his world, his caretakers, his protectors, his adversaries, were gone. He dragged their bodies clumsily, leaving smears of blood across the floor, and left them in the small basement utility room, covering them with a tarp as if to erase what had happened. Then, shockingly, he returned to his bedroom, cleaned the knife, and went back online. In the days that followed, Daniel attempted to maintain a veneer of normal life. He told friends his parents had gone to visit relatives. He left lights on in the house to give the impression of life continuing as usual. He even went to work briefly, smiling faintly when asked about his weekend. But behind closed doors, the house was silent, the air heavy with the stench of death. It didn't take long for suspicion to grow. Neighbors noticed Marilyn's absence. She was the type who always checked in, who never missed church, who stopped by to gossip over coffee. Raoul's employer grew concerned when he failed to show up for several days without calling. When relatives tried to contact them and received no answer, alarm bells rang louder. Within a week, police arrived at the Mendez home to conduct a welfare check. Daniel answered the door calmly, insisting his parents were out of town, but officers immediately noticed inconsistencies. The mail had piled up. The house carried an odor that was impossible to ignore. When police pressed Daniel, his composure cracked. Eventually, investigators searched the basement and discovered Raoul and Marilyn's bodies under the tarp. Daniel was arrested on the spot. At first, he tried to deny responsibility, claiming an intruder must have broken in. But the evidence was overwhelming. The knife was found hidden in his room, still bearing traces of his parents' blood. His clothing, washed but poorly, contained microscopic remnants. Under interrogation, Daniel eventually confessed, his words chilling in their detachment. He said he was tired of being treated like a failure, tired of feeling trapped. Killing them, he claimed, was a way to end the constant noise. News of the crime spread quickly through the neighborhood. Shock gave way to horror. These were not strangers, not figures in the headlines from far away. They were neighbors, friends, the family down the street. Marilyn, who baked cookies for children and helped watch over elderly neighbors. Raul, who offered to help repair fences and mow lawns when others fell ill. Their deaths and the fact that their own son was responsible shattered the sense of safety on the block. The trial became a grim spectacle. Prosecutors argued that Daniel had committed cold-blooded murder, fueled by resentment and self-pity. They highlighted his preparation, the stolen knife, the concealment of the bodies, the lies he told afterward. The defense sought to portray Daniel as mentally unstable, overwhelmed by depression and a distorted sense of reality. They called psychiatrists to testify that he lacked the emotional maturity to handle conflict and rejection, but the jury saw through the arguments, the brutality of the crime, the intimacy of the violence, and Daniel's chilling lack of remorse sealed the verdict. He was convicted of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. In the courtroom, relatives of Raul and Marilyn wept not only for the couple who had been killed, but for the young man who had destroyed his own life in the process. In prison, Daniel has remained largely emotionless. Guards describe him as withdrawn, often avoiding interaction with other inmates. He does not speak of his parents. He has never apologized publicly. It is as if, to him, their deaths were not tragedies but inevitabilities. For the Cleveland neighborhood, the Mendez home became a symbol of the betrayal of trust. For years, people drove past slowly, staring at the house where parents had been murdered by their son. Eventually, the property was sold, repainted, remodeled, but whispers about its past never fully faded. What remains haunting about the case is the way violence erupted, not from strangers or outside threats, but from within the family itself. Daniel's crime asks a question that unsettles every parent who hears it. How well do we truly know the children we raise? Parents hope their love will protect, their guidance will shape, but sometimes darkness takes root where it is least expected. The story of Daniel Mendez reminds us that danger does not always come in the form of a masked intruder or a shadow on the street. Sometimes it grows quietly, nurtured by resentment and disconnection, until one night it destroys everything in its path. Raul and Marilyn's lives ended not because they failed as parents, but because their son chose violence over reconciliation. The silence left in their absence lingers still, a chilling echo of betrayal that turned a family home into a crime scene. Phoenix, Arizona, August 2010. In a desert suburb where stucco houses stood in neat rows and the sun painted the streets with relentless heat, neighbors prided themselves on their friendliness. Children rode bicycles under the dim glow of streetlights. Families barbecued in backyards. People waved when they drove past one another. It was the kind of neighborhood that seemed safe, comfortable, unremarkable. But within one of those tidy homes, trust was about to be betrayed in the most horrifying way. The Collins family lived a life that seemed ordinary. Thomas Collins was a retired postal worker, a man in his late 60s who spent his days tending to his garden and chatting with neighbors about sports and weather. His wife, Angela, was known for her kindness, often baking pies for community gatherings and lending a hand to those in need. Their neighbor and longtime friend, a younger man named Eric Mendoza, lived across the street. Eric was 32, a mechanic by trade, a man who had shared countless dinners with the Collinses, who had borrowed tools from Thomas, who had sat at their table as if he were family. The Collinses treated Eric like a son. Angela often invited him over for meals, knowing he lived alone. Thomas trusted him with spare keys to the house, a convenience in case they ever needed someone to water the plants or pick up mail while they traveled. But soon the boundary between trust and exploitation began to blur completely. On the night of August 21st, Eric crossed a line he could never return from. He entered the Collins' home using the spare key they had given him. It was late, well past midnight, and the couple was asleep upstairs. Eric moved quietly, searching for valuables, his heart pounding as he rifled through drawers. But as fate would have it, Thomas awoke. Hearing the faint sounds downstairs, he rose to investigate. What happened next shattered every notion of neighborly trust. Thomas confronted Eric in the living room, shocked to see the man he had welcomed into his home standing there with his belongings in hand. Words were exchanged. Anger, confusion, betrayal. Eric panicked, fearing exposure, fearing the collapse of his fragile life. He lashed out. A violent struggle ensued. Eric grabbed a heavy lamp and struck Thomas across the head. The blow was fatal. Angela, hearing the commotion, rushed downstairs. She froze at the sight of her husband, lying lifeless, her trusted neighbor standing above him with the weapon in his hands. She screamed. Eric, in a blind frenzy, turned on her as well. The woman who had fed him, who had embraced him like family, became his second victim. He strangled her until the house fell silent, the air heavy with the weight of betrayal. Afterward, Eric attempted to stage the scene as a burglary gone wrong. He scattered items, broke a window, and fled into the night. But what he could not disguise was the truth that this was no random crime, no faceless intruder. This was a neighbor, a friend, someone the Collinses had trusted with their lives. For 2 days, the couple's absence went unnoticed. Neighbors assumed they were visiting family. Mail piled up, the garden went unattended, and the house remained eerily still. It wasn't until a relative stopped by that the horror was discovered. Inside, police found the bodies of Thomas and Angela, their home ransacked, their lives brutally ended. Investigators quickly suspected foul play. While the staged burglary was convincing at a glance, detectives noticed inconsistencies. The broken window had been shattered from the inside, not the outside. Valuables like jewelry and electronics were left untouched, while drawers were oddly disturbed. Most tellingly, there was no sign of forced entry. Whoever had committed the crime had entered with a key. Suspicion soon turned to Eric Mendoza. He had been seen in the area the night of the murders. His financial troubles were well known. When police questioned him, his story was riddled with contradictions. Detectives obtained a warrant and found items belonging to the Collinses hidden in his garage. The trust that had once bound neighbor to neighbor had become the very rope that tightened around Eric's neck. At trial, prosecutors emphasized the betrayal. This wasn't just murder. It was the destruction of the very concept of community. The Collinses had opened their home to Eric, had trusted him as family, and he had repaid them with violence. The defense argued desperation, claiming Eric had not intended to kill but had panicked when confronted. But the brutality of the attack told another story. The jury deliberated only briefly before convicting him on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death for the neighborhood. The crime was devastating. People who had once left their doors unlocked now double-checked their locks each night. The Collins home, once filled with warmth and hospitality, became a crime scene marked by caution tape and whispers. Angela's pies were missed at community gatherings. Thomas's voice, once heard laughing across the fence, was gone forever. The betrayal cut deeper than most crimes because it forced everyone to question the very foundation of trust. The Collinses had done what good neighbors do. They cared, they gave, they trusted, and that trust was weaponized against them. For those who lived nearby, the crime was not just about loss, it was about the shattering of an illusion. If kindness could lead to this, what did that mean for the way they viewed their own neighbors? In the years since, the case has lingered in the minds of true crime enthusiasts and locals alike. The image of a friendly neighbor turning into a killer is one of the most disturbing scenarios imaginable. It is a story that forces reflection on the fragility of safety, on how quickly the line between friendship and danger can dissolve. Eric Mendoza sits on death row today, his appeals dwindling. He has expressed regret in interviews, though many doubt the sincerity of his words. For the relatives of Thomas and Angela, no apology could ever undo the betrayal. They mourn not only the loss of 2 lives, but the destruction of trust in a community that once felt safe. The story of the Collins family is a haunting reminder that danger does not always come from strangers lurking in shadows. Sometimes it comes from the people we wave to across the street, the ones we welcome into our homes, the ones we believe we know. It reminds us of the chilling reality behind the video's title. When neighbors become killers, the betrayal cuts deeper than any wound, leaving behind scars that never fade. Which cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments.